Hi, thank you for stopping by to give our talk a listen. Today, my co-authors and I wish to share with you a new approach for providing students with meaningful feedback following field-based activities. One of the aspects of teaching that has long troubled me is how to best provide my students with meaningful feedback on field-based activities. Intuitively, I know that since instruction is happening in the field, it would be best to provide that feedback while students are still in the environment. However, I, like I suspect is true of many of you, have rarely done this sort of debrief in the same setting that I actually used for my activities. This is often because a number of aspects associated with how I generally run field activities, for example, the time it takes for me to actually do the activity, and maybe the logistics and/or access to the field area itself, always seem to get in the way of me actually running a successful debrief. Nonetheless, we really do need to find a way to provide effective feedback that reinforces learning outcomes and helps them develop the ability to make useful observations and sound interpretations while they are working in the field. Let's start by taking a look at a couple of examples of the types of activities we typically run as field instructors in terms of how debriefs work, or rather, how they don't. At one end of the spectrum, we have activities that are associated with field trips in core courses like structural geology or sedimentology and stratigraphy, or maybe even an introductory field methods course. Typically, the time for these activities is tight. They are typically run during 1 to 4 day field trips that are hooked over a weekend and require travel away from a campus to conduct. The relatively short duration of these field trips makes it often difficult to budget time for a debrief and still provide students with enough time to accomplish the goals of the activity. Because of this, many instructors will opt to wait until the activity is over, the group has returned to campus, and all of the submitted work has been graded before running a debrief during a class or during lab time. At the other end of the spectrum are field activities that are associated with extended capstone experiences like summer field camps. Regardless of whether these capstone courses are run as residential or traveling camps, these activities are often longer than standard course-related field trips. Similarly, these activities tend to be much more complicated and often cover much larger geographic areas. Compounding these complexities, these capstone courses tend to comprise a series of activities that are lined up, back to maximize return on the considerable cost in time and resources that are needed to run these classes. For these reasons, in-person debriefs in the field following an activity are often foregone because of the potential impact on schedule and resources, and generally replaced with reviews of key concepts at night between projects. Now that we've explored the spectrum of need for debriefings in the courses that we offer, let's take stock of some of the good and bad aspects of how we've traditionally been handling the reviews of key concepts after our activities. First, let's consider the debriefings that we conduct in the classroom following a field activity. On the good side, these tend to be quick and targeted. It's possible to focus the discussion and target key examples. Similarly, these debriefings tend to have limited impact on the resources needed to conduct the original activity. However, on the bad side, these sorts of debriefings are deeply troubled by the fact that they entirely rely upon a student's ability to recall and visualize the relationships they observed in the field. Indeed, the success of this approach lies entirely upon the assumption that a student, someone who is actually still in the process of learning to make observations and interpretations, is in many cases essentially being expected to have done so successfully in order to fully appreciate and follow the logic being outlined by an instructor during a debriefing. On the other hand, actual instructor-led physical walkthroughs of a field area following an activity might not be any more successful in the end. On the good side, these face-to-face debriefings provide opportunities to reinforce key relationships within the geologic context of the field area that actually contains them. For example, it's possible for students to see why contacts should be drawn in a particular way given how the rocks are weathering out, the types of vegetation growing in different units, and even what real cross-cutting relationships actually look like. However, as much as this approach might make sense, it's also clear that these walkthroughs might present very real problems of their own in terms of accessibility or meeting the needs of all the students in the group. For example, we've attempted several iterations of instructor-led debriefings over the years at the Wasatch Uinta Field Camp, and student responses generally suggest that many of them feel the group-level feedback didn't contain sufficient detail to make them helpful and or address their actual individual needs. So, given these approaches, it's not entirely surprising why more time and resources aren't poured into debriefings. They're impractical, or at least they are the way that we've been traditionally doing them. Group-level feedback is fine, but insufficient if we expect our students to actually master the skills that we're trying to teach them. Similarly, individual feedback is generally limited to written comments on graded items, which is entirely insufficient when it comes to trying to identify and correct the problems that individual students are having with their own ability to make observations and interpretations in the field. So, the inevitable result is a general default to group-level, instructor-led debriefings that occur outside of the actual environment of instruction. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, the COVID-19 pandemic forced our community to drastically ramp up our toolkit of digital and virtual resources in order to shift from traditional face-to-face, field-based instruction to online alternatives in response to distance learning restrictions. The result of this unprecedented effort is a truly impressive array of new tools, techniques, and pedagogical strategies. If you're unaware of these resources, or perhaps if it's been some time since you last dug into them, I encourage you to do so. I've provided 3 links down below as QR codes to help you get started. From left to right, these links will take you to a page with information on how to think about developing digital or virtual activities, a page outlining key technologies and tools for online instruction, and finally, a page in the Teach the Earth archive at CERC that outlines all of the activities and modules generated to meet the needs of our students during the pandemic. As we move ahead into the future, or perhaps what might better be thought of as the new normal, these elements are actually beginning to take on a brand new life of their own. We are starting to see how these resources can be integrated in new hybrid approaches that provide unique opportunities to help us improve how we traditionally taught in the field. Not only are these new hybrid approaches helping students learn more effectively, they're also helping to overcome some really significant and long-lived barriers to accessibility and actually helping to improve field safety at the same time. An excellent example of one of these techniques is the use of 3-dimensional photospheres and virtual field trips. One of the co-authors on this talk, Ryan Petterson, is giving a separate and more detailed talk on this very same subject also in this session, so I'll keep this overview brief. Essentially, it's possible to use the free Google Street View app to quickly capture surprisingly high-resolution 3-dimensional spherical photos. These photos, once collected, can be linked together into a customizable, interactive virtual field trip using the Pano 2VR tour building program from Garden Gnome software. Pano 2VR also has the capability to integrate still images, video clips, and even photospheres that have been annotated using Adobe Photoshop. Finally, Pano 2VR can export these virtual field trips as HTML files that can be hosted on any standard web hosting service and are viewable on any desktop or mobile device. Taken all together, the customizability and accessibility of these virtual field trips makes them an incredibly powerful educational tool. We suggest that these virtual field trips are potentially a much more effective platform for delivering feedback than the traditional debriefing methods we've been using before. The fact that these web-based tours can be accessed independently by both instructors and students and at the same time creates a really unique opportunity, one that's more akin to actually standing around an outcrop with students and having a discussion over the exposure. Instructors are provided with an effective tool for quickly relocating the entire group from key point to key point of interest without the need to spend a whole bunch of time hiking around in a field area. And, if needed, they can quickly return to a previous location and/or switch back and forth between remote locations in a way that would be utterly impossible to do so effectively in the field. Finally, the ability to annotate photospheres to highlight key geologic relationships creates a situation where instructors can help orient students to important fields of view and then allow students the agency to independently go through and further manipulate their own perspectives to reinforce their own understandings. The result is that students may receive significantly more meaningful feedback and potentially make much more progress when it comes to developing their own field skills. To test this idea, we used a virtual field trip to conduct a debriefing associated with a recent field trip to Rainbow Basin in the Mojave Desert of southeastern California. During this trip, 2 days were spent traveling, leaving only 2 days for intensive field education. Because of this, we decided to conduct our debrief over Zoom back at campus following the return of their graded materials. Students were tasked with completing a bedrock geologic map and geologic cross-section in their field area, which was then assessed using standard rubrics. To conduct our debrief, we simply modified the same virtual field trip that we used to introduce the field area and orient students before we left on the field trip, as part of the pre-activity safety orientation. All the modifications that we made to our original virtual field trip were completed after we returned from the field, and comprised several photospheres that were annotated using Pano2VR and Adobe Photoshop to highlight geologic relationships that the students were struggling with in the field. These annotated photospheres were indicated with green nodes in the key map in the virtual field trip to make them easier to identify. During the discussion, students were encouraged to follow along with the instructor-led discussion, but were also encouraged to manipulate their own fields of view so that they could fully explore relationships and enhance the feedback that they were receiving. Finally, it's worth mentioning that since these virtual tours are relatively simple web-based files, it really is actually pretty easy to control student access. All you need to do is to break any links in course management interfaces and/or to remove the file from the server or simply move it to a different location on that server. In case you haven't had a chance to play with one of Ryan Petterson's virtual field trips, here's a quick peek at some of their basic elements and how we've adapted it for use with our debriefings. After removing the title screen, you are immediately placed within one of the photospheres integrated into the virtual field trip. You can pan and zoom through that photosphere and use either the hotlinks that are placed inside the field of view or one of the nodes in the index map in the upper left corner to move to another photosphere. A moving red cone in the index map indicates your current field of view, and the contents of that map can be zoomed in and out of as well, resized, and even toggled to show different types of information like topography, satellite imagery, and even geologic maps or map keys. When appropriate in this example, you can use a button in the lower left-hand corner to toggle on or off geologic annotations to support your discussion with students. To begin comparing traditional feedback methods to debriefs conducted using virtual field trips, we formulated a simple pre-post survey to examine how well students felt feedback delivered using a virtual field trip helped them to see what they failed to observe in the field, as well as how it helped them to understand the relationships they may have misinterpreted. We also asked them how this feedback might have prepared them to better be able to identify the geologic relationships that they missed should they encounter them again in the future. What we found is that the virtual field trip provided a small advantage for students in understanding both what they failed to observe as well as what they may have misinterpreted, with a small gain of about half a point on the Likert scale. A moderate gain of about 1.5 points on the Likert scale also suggests that students felt like the virtual field trip was a more useful tool for receiving feedback in comparison to previous instructor-led explanations that they had received in the past. Students also seemed to report that following the virtual field trip debrief, they had a slightly higher level of confidence in their ability to correctly identify the geologic relationships that they missed if they were put into another similar project in the future. Furthermore, students had an overall very positive reaction to the virtual debrief. One student said, "I really liked the virtual field trip. It helped me understand what was going on a little better." And another student commented that the virtual field trip was very effective for displaying and discussing the relationships we saw in the field. As a visual learner, having the graphics to clearly outline what was being discussed helped me immensely. In conclusion, we'd like to leave you folks with a couple of take-home messages. The first is that our preliminary results seem to suggest that virtual field trips may potentially be a better platform for delivering useful feedback in post-activity debriefs of field activities. Secondly, this is only one of the many examples of exciting ways that tools that were originally developed to help mitigate the impacts of the COVID pandemic are now being used to accomplish incredibly helpful things as we move forward into the new normal of field education. In terms of what we're looking to do next, we fully acknowledge that our preliminary results are based entirely on a small sample of only about 13 students. We are planning to improve our methodology and replicate this study in 2022 with student groups conducting field activities from two-year colleges, another offering of this introductory field methods course, and at the Wasatch Uinta Field Camp. Along the same lines, it's also important to consider that our preliminary data are entirely self-reported. So, one of the things that we will be looking to address is to figure out a way to actually test if students do better in the future following feedback using virtual field trips. Secondly, we're also considering other ways of hosting our virtual field trip-driven debriefings. One particularly promising option is to use three-dimensional models derived using structure from motion and drone footage that are hosted within Sketchfab. Using this technique, we would actually be able to drape base maps over the false topographies and place nodes for photospheres directly on the surface of the model itself. Thank you very much for your time and consideration, and we look forward to chatting with you and hopefully answering any questions that you might have.